There was no sun that day, only a pale sky and a city that held its breath. And on a hill outside Jerusalem, 3 crosses waited, 2 for criminals, and 1 for a man the crowds once called Messiah. One of the thieves couldn't stop shaking, not because of the nails, but because of the silence. The silence of a life wasted, the silence between every heartbeat, and most of all, the silence coming from the man crucified beside him. Jesus. Why did this thief, in his final moments, look at Jesus and smile? And what made him believe he could still be seen by heaven after everything he had done? Because even in his shame, he recognized something holy in the brokenness. Because sometimes the most honest prayers are whispered in pain, with blood on the lips and regret in the heart. He didn't ask for rescue. He didn't plead for justice. He simply looked at a man who shouldn't have been there, a man who had no business dying like a criminal, and yet wasn't cursing anyone. Not the crowd, not the sky, not even the ones who nailed him there. And in that gaze, the thief saw more than flesh and suffering. He saw a king. His breath was shallow, but his courage grew. "Remember me," he said. 2 words. That's all. No excuses. Just a broken man asking to be remembered. Jesus turned to him slowly, painfully, and the look in his eyes was not pity. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was welcome. "Today you'll be with me." The thief didn't smile because he was free from the cross. He smiled because he was finally free from everything else. The prison cell was damp and narrow, no wider than the outstretched arms of the man inside. Chains clinked softly as the thief shifted in the dark, his back against the wall, his gaze lost in nothingness. Outside, the city whispered with Ennie's rumors of trials, unrest, and a man called Jesus. But inside that stone box, time moved differently, slower, heavier. He had stolen many things in life, food, coins, freedom, but now, all he wanted to steal was time. One more day, one more chance, not to escape, but to breathe before the end came. He remembered the guard's voice, cold and final. "You're not dying alone, there's another." 2 others, actually. One of them is that Nazarene the thief had scoffed. Jesus, that gentle lunatic, the one who talked about loving enemies and turning cheeks. He wasn't like them, not like him. The thief didn't know what kind of game Rome was playing, but pairing a prophet with criminals smelled more like mockery than justice. Still, something stirred, a curiosity, not fear, exactly, but not peace either. He turned to the other thief, chained beside him, silent, twitching in his sleep. The 3rd cell, they said, was for Jesus, but it remained empty through the night, and that, somehow, made the silence feel even louder. As dawn approached, the guard returned, heavy steps echoing in the hallway, iron keys clanging metal. "It's time." The thief didn't fight. His wrists were bruised, his body aching, but there was no energy left for resistance. As he stepped into the daylight, the sky looked wrong, clouds rolling too fast, light too pale. Even the sun seemed hesitant. On the way to the execution site, the crowd jeered. Not at him, though. At the man in the center, bloodied and crowned with thorns. The thief had expected defiance, maybe a sermon shouted from a cross, but what he saw froze his breath. Jesus didn't look defeated. He looked ready. Not like a hero, but like someone who had made peace with everything. The 3 crosses stood like black teeth against the sky. The soldiers nailed their wrists, lifted their bodies, then waited. The pain was unimaginable. The thief screamed, cursed, trembled. His breath was short, his mouth dry with blood. And yet, between spasms of agony, he turned to look at Jesus, expecting rage, expecting madness. But Jesus was praying for them, for the people below. "Father, forgive them, ... The thief's stomach turned. "Forgive them." After this, the other thief spat through his pain. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." His voice was venom, a laugh covered in blood. But the first thief couldn't bear it. "Don't you fear God?" he croaked, each word scraping his throat. "We're getting what we deserve, ... But this man ... he did nothing wrong." And then, turning with tears blurring his vision, he whispered to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." The pause that followed was eternal, not in time, but in weight. Then, Jesus turned his head slowly, as if even this motion held sacred meaning, and met the thief's eyes. His lips cracked open with effort. "Today, you will be with me in paradise." The words didn't make sense, not logically, but they pierced something deeper. The thief blinked hard. A warmth bloomed in his chest, like a fire flickering in the ruins of his soul. He wanted to smile, but his muscles were too broken. Still, a breath escaped him, not of pain, but of release. He didn't know what paradise looked like, but if it had that voice, if it had that gaze, then maybe dying wasn't loss. Maybe it was arrival. As the sky darkened and the earth trembled, the thief didn't scream anymore. He just breathed. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. The prison was colder that night, not because of the weather but because silence had settled over the stones like dust that refused to be swept away. No screams, no curses, only the soft clink of chains and the breathing of men too tired to fear. In a dark corner the thief sat curled, arms wrapped around his knees, forehead resting on cold iron. He hadn't slept, not since the whisper. That whisper that wasn't really a voice but felt louder than the guard's shouts, "You will be with me." He had replayed those 5 words over and over, like a song he didn't know he needed. You, with me, not condemned, not forgotten, not worthless. The thief didn't know what he expected to hear in his final hours. Maybe mockery, maybe silence, but what he got was promise. Still, promise doesn't always silence pain. His body ached from beatings. His wrists burned where the ropes had carved into flesh. He could smell the blood, his and others. The stench of fear hung heavy, but there was something else now, something different. Hope. It was a fragile thing. This hope, like a candle lit inside a hurricane. He didn't dare show it, not where the other men could see. They would laugh, spit, maybe worse. But inside, where no one could reach, that candle stayed lit, and with it, a question he was afraid to answer. Could it be true? The hours dragged. Footsteps echoed through the corridors, the guards dragging another prisoner past his cell. He glanced up and froze. The man was barely recognizable, but the eyes were the same. Eyes that had met his just hours before, above 2 crosses. In a moment of shared agony, Jesus, beaten, bloodied, still breathing, still walking. The thief gripped the bars and whispered his name, not in prayer, not yet, but like a lifeline. And then Jesus was gone from sight, swallowed by stone and distance. But that moment, it shook something loose in him. Not guilt. He had drowned in guilt for years. It was something else. He had never seen it in himself, not as a boy, not as a man. But that look, those eyes, they had seen something in him he couldn't explain. Jesus had not looked at him like a mistake, not even like a project to fix, but like a man, a soul, a name worth remembering. He whispered again, this time softer with me. And then it happened. The chains around his wrists tightened out from outside force. But memory, every time they had pulled him toward sin, dragged him away from light, held him close to the shadows. And yet, here he was, still breathing, still seen, still wanted. The door creaked. A guard entered with a torch and a rope. No words were needed. It was time. The thief stood slowly, not with pride, not with peace, but with something dangerously close to resolve. They led him through the corridors, past empty cells and broken men. His feet dragged, but not from fear. The weight of a life lived in ruins, and a final hour holding the promise of paradise. He stepped into the sunlight. It blinded him, not just because of the brightness, but because of what stood ahead. 3 crosses, 2 upright, 1 still being raised, and at the center of it all Jesus. They threw him to the ground. He did not fight. His eyes remained fixed on the center cross, on the man who had made the promise. Nails were readied, arms outstretched. The pain that followed was unspeakable, but his mouth did not scream. It whispered, remember me. The hammer struck, again and again, but above the noise, above the agony, above the mocking crowd, the thief held on to 5 words, like a mantra, like a rope around his soul to keep him from slipping. You will be with me. He didn't know what would come next, only that somehow that man, the rabbi, that king in rags, would keep his word. Even if the world didn't, even if he himself couldn't, even if his breath faded before the sun did. The sky began to darken, though the day was still young. And in the silence between heartbeats, as blood stained the ground and the earth itself seemed to mourn, the thief began to smile. If this part moved something inside you, subscribe to our channel. There are still pieces of the story waiting to be told, pieces that might just be your own. The sky broke before his spirit did. It wasn't just the pain that tore through his arms, it was the silence that followed. A strange silence, unnatural, as though the world was holding its breath. Noon had not yet passed, but the sky darkened as if night had arrived early, uninvited. People murmured. Some screamed. Others pointed at the heavens in terror. But he watched the man in the middle, jeers, barely breathing, stripped of dignity, crowned with thorns and mockery. And yet, even in the worst moment of suffering, his face held something that didn't make sense. Not peace, not strength, something like surrender, a holy letting go. The thief blinked back, tears, not from pain, but from he had seen men die before, dozens, screaming, pleading, cursing, but Jesus. He was silent in a way that didn't feel empty. It felt full, like he wasn't losing anything, but giving something like this was not being taken from him. He was offering it, like a lamb, like a king. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his body trembling. Blood dripped slowly from his wrists, sliding down his arm and pooling near his ribs. Breathing felt like swallowing fire. He turned his head slowly, still mocking. Even now, with death inches away, he clung to bitterness like it could save him. The thief, our thief, closed his eyes. He couldn't hate the other man, not anymore that used to be him. Rage, blame, Sarcasm, tools for the soul, too tired to believe in anything else. He understood it, but he no longer lived there. He had crossed some invisible line. Somewhere between the whisper of Jesus and the darkness in the sky, something inside him had changed forever. And then Jesus spoke, a voice like gravel and thunder, barely more than breath. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." The thief flinched. He wasn't talking about the soldiers. He wasn't just talking about the crowd. He was talking about all of them. Even him. Even the man who still hurled insults through bloody teeth. Forgiveness. Even now. Even here. His chest tightened, not with fear but with longing. He didn't deserve paradise, he knew that. But hearing those words, so drenched in mercy, he realized something else. No one deserves it. And that's what makes it grace. The ground beneath began to tremble. A soft rumble, like a groan rising from the bones of the earth itself. Screams erupted. Rocks split. But the thief didn't see any of that. His eyes were fixed on Jesus. Jesus who had said his name with love. Jesus who had seen past the grime and guilt. Jesus who promised to be with him. Today was almost too much. How could such love exist? How could he be part of it? Then Jesus cried out loud this time, not just a whisper, but a roar that shook the sky. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And with that he exhaled. A long, final breath, and he was gone. The thief stopped breathing too, for a moment. Not from death, but from grief. The man who had seen him, he was gone. The silence was louder than ever. And yet, the thief smiled again. Not a smile of triumph, but of trust. Because if that man had the power to die like that, then maybe he also had the power to live again. And maybe, just maybe, he would keep his word. "You will be with me." Maybe not today. Maybe not in the way he expected. But soon enough to matter. The darkness deepened. His vision blurred. But the fire inside him, small, flickering sacred, remained, a candle lit by a dying king. A king who had once said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." If this part stirred your heart, hit subscribe. The final chapter is near. And some endings are more than just conclusions. They're beginnings. The stone was cold, rolled into place like a period at the end of a sentence the world wasn't yet ready to finish. And for 3 long days, silence ruled. No more crowds. No more crosses. Only grief echoing through the hearts of the few who still dared to hope. Somewhere beyond that sealed tomb, beyond the city walls, a body still hung. Lifeless, forsaken, forgotten. The thief. No name carved. No visitors. No one waiting. His story should have ended on that cross, with blood and regret and a final flicker of faith. But heaven does not forget what men discard. And the one who died beside him, he had made a promise. "You will be with me." Not just a farewell. Not poetic comfort. A vow. And Jesus didn't break vows. That's what changed everything. Because on the 3rd day, when the earth shook again, this time not with agony but with awakening, the impossible became truth. The stone moved, the tomb opened, and death lost its throne. The risen Christ stepped out of the silence, not with vengeance, not with power clenched in fists, but with scars still in his hands and peace in his eyes. He walked among the living again. He spoke, he ate, he embraced, and every moment, every breath, echoed a deeper reality. The grave is not the end for those whom mercy has touched. Somewhere the soul of a thief smiled again. We don't know where. We don't know how. But if Jesus meant what he said, and every scar on his body shouted that he did, then that man who died with his hands tied and his heart open, he was not lost, he was found, he was not judged, he was redeemed. He was not forgotten. He was welcomed. Maybe in the first moments of eternity, when the gates of glory opened wide, there stood a king still bearing wounds, and beside him a man who had nothing to offer but a whispered, "Remember me." And the king smiled back. Because grace doesn't work like the world works. It doesn't check credentials or measure deeds. It sees the heart. Even when the world only sees the past, the thief never got to live a righteous life. He didn't preach, or serve, or give back. He died. But in dying, he believed. And sometimes, belief at the edge of death is enough to open the gates of life. He wasn't a saint. He was a sinner with a story that began in pain, but didn't end there. Because grace rewrites endings, and heaven loves broken beginnings. Somewhere in glory there's a man who never imagined he'd be there. He still remembers the sound of nails, the cries of the crowd, the ache in his ribs, the blood in his eyes. But most of all, he remembers the voice, not the mockery, not the judgment. The voice, "You will be with me." And now he is. Not because he earned it, but because he was seen, chosen, saved, by the same hands that broke bread and bore nails, by the same eyes that looked past guilt and into possibility, by a Savior who died next to him not to shame him, but to bring him home. That's the story of the thief who died smiling, not because he escaped justice, but because, in the final breath of life, he found what every soul longs for, not freedom from pain, not rescue from consequence, but to be known and still loved. He found that, and so can you. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe that redemption is still possible, even in the final hour. Subscribe, because stories like this, they never really end.